everyone. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate you coming in the second of our three sessions on post-harvest handling for food safety. As you can tell today, a lot of the focus is going to be honestly on things that are not only important for food safety, but also for crop quality, because one of the beautiful things about food safety is that a lot of times when you're doing a good job on the safety front, you're also going to find that you get a real benefit in the shelf life of your crops. And especially when you're selling direct to consumer and some of these competitive markets where, you know, your reputation definitely is tied to your farm name, right? And building that reputation is important. So getting your post-harvest handling right is really key. We have joining us today Annette Wszelaki. Annette, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you. My name is Annette Wszelaki. I recognize several of your faces from last week, so it's good to see repeat customers. And as Faith mentioned, we're going to be talking about post-harvest today. And that's a great topic because it does apply to everybody, no matter what your size or what you grow. And I'm the vegetable extension specialist at the University of Tennessee. But during my grad school days, I studied post-harvest physiology at UC Davis. So it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart.
Great. And Karen, I'll also let you introduce yourself and kind of talk about this, where the funding came for this program.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Ullman. I work with the Washington State Department of Agriculture. My position is currently located in our regional markets program, which helps to support small and direct marketing farms with education, resources, regulatory interpretation, all that good stuff. And I also work part-time with our ProduceSafety program, which is involved in educating on the FSMA produce safety rule, and also involved in compliance and enforcement around that rule. And so I play that educational arm of both programs and have been involved with on-farm food safety education for several years here from the Washington State Department of Agriculture. I'm also happy to see some repeat faces here and some folks that I know. So we thought that this would be a really good topic, this whole series, as I mentioned last week, to provide for you guys. I think it does fill the gap, particularly this module where we're going to be focusing more on extending the shelf life for your crops. I love how that quality piece and food safety really tie hand in hand. So I think this is going to be great content. If you liked it in particular, any of these series, any feedback for me, I'll drop my email in the chat. If you want to let me know to be providing things similar to this in the future, we can certainly do so. And this was, just to give you guys some of the funding background, this was funded by FDA Cooperative Agreement, which is essentially establishes a relationship between WSDA and FDA to deliver content and to develop a compliance and enforcement program. So that's how we're bringing this to you guys. And I can also share in the chat some more of our main landing page for that program and the website if you wanted to look into it a little bit further. Some things that you can note there, some good resources, and also our listserv is available for sign up there. So you can be keeping up to date on new policy items and information that comes out down the line on FSMA as things continue to evolve and develop, and new science comes out and we learn new things and we develop more trainings based on that. So we'd be happy to have you included on that. So that's my spiel. I'll be here in the background as things come up, questions, anything like that. So happy to have you guys.
Great, thanks. And yeah, I echo both Annette and Karen's messages that great to see some of you back again for this second installment. So thanks for joining us. We are going to be doing the same thing where we're recording the session and then putting it up on YouTube for those people who couldn't be with us, or if you're like, oh, I want to go back and remember that, right? So it'll be available to you, and we'll email that out to everyone after probably I was really optimistic, but probably towards the end of the week, I'll get it out to everyone so that you have it in your inbox ready to go. So without further ado, if you joined us last week, you heard Annette and I kind of going back and forth a lot. Since she's the expert, I'm going to let her drive the bus this week, and I'll interject. But yeah, she's definitely the post-harvest guru in our duo and in real life also. So Annette, without further ado, why don't you take it away?
All right. Thanks, Faith. So let me get my screen up here. Oh. Can everybody see that all right? Right. Yep. View. All right. So this is a nice size group. We're at about 20 right now. I'm sure we'll have a few more that might join in. But if at any time, if something I say doesn't make sense, if I'm going too fast, if you have a question, you can feel free to unmute and just ask it, or you can type it in the chat and Faith can interrupt and ask it for you if you'd prefer. So either way will work. And let's just dive right in. As both Faith and Karen mentioned, post-harvest is something that benefits your production in general. And because it benefits your production, as well as the food safety aspect, it's also going to benefit your bottom line. If you can give your customers a long shelf life, they notice that and they'll come back to you. And we'll talk about some more examples of that as we go. Again, we want to thank the WSDA and the FDA for funding for this webinar series, and that was made under the grant number 5U18FD05913-05. So that's from the FDA, and the contents are solely mine in this case. We can't even blame Faith for any of it because it's all me. So it doesn't represent the WSDA or the FDA necessarily, but I don't think I'm saying anything that they would disagree with. Just have to have that little disclaimer there. All right. So this is really the basis for everything we're going to talk about today. And something that I want you to think about as you move about on your farm. We can't improve that quality after harvest. We can only maintain it because it's at its best right at that peak on that plant. Once we remove it, we've basically removed its life support by taking it off that plant. So the best we can shoot for is to maintain the quality at harvest. So we're going to talk a lot about some pre-harvest things as well as the post-harvest aspects that will maintain that quality all the way through till your customer uses it. But really, high quality produce is going to result from your sound production practices, as well as that proper handling during harvest, and then your appropriate post-harvest handling and storage. And we're going to talk about all three of these as we go. So really, your quality is going to start before you ever put a seed or a plant in the ground. And it starts with your variety selection. So we want to make sure that we're matching that variety to your market needs. And that varies whether you're selling wholesale or whether you're selling at a farmer's market, how far you have to travel to get to that market, right? And tomatoes are a great example of that first one, that firmness. If you're traveling, if your tomato is traveling a long way from your farm to get to its final market, it's going to have to be a firmer tomato, have a firmer skin, a thicker skin on it to make it through that handling chain. If you're going to the farmer's market and it's close by, then we can go for some thinner skin varieties. Maybe some of those heirloom varieties are popular at the farmer's markets. Uniformity is another one. This one, again, is more of a wholesale market issue. Oftentimes, pumpkins are a great example. In a wholesale market, we want 15-pound pumpkins. We want them the same color orange. We want them very uniform throughout. If you're in a direct market setting, you have a lot more latitude there. And oftentimes that non-uniformity can really be a great selling point. So to have pumpkins of all shapes and sizes, as well as colors, can really be a market benefit. So again, we just want to think about what market we're going to. No matter what your market, These next three are important. So disease and pest resistance. And that's really important because that's your first line of defense in your integrated pest management program. If you start with a variety that has some disease resistance, that can go a long way and reduce your overall on-farm inputs, which again is going to help your bottom line if you don't have to spend that money on some sprays that will help with disease control later on because you have it within that variety, or you could spray less because you have a good disease resistant variety. The next one is shelf life, and we all want the longest possible shelf life for our product, and we'll talk a ton about that in the next hour and a half or 2 hours. And then flavor, of course. People buy from the look of produce, but they come back for the flavor of your produce. So we want to make sure we're maximizing not only the shelf life, but also the flavor. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And excuse my lingering cough, I'll have to stop and take some drinks once in a while. So as far as environmental factors that are going to affect your quality, some are really beyond our control. So once you buy a farm, you have the soil that you have on that farm, but soil type can affect your quality and it can affect your flavor. And grapes are a great example of that in the Napa Valley with their terroir. Also up in Washington, you guys have a lot of wine grapes up there too. Temperature is another one that we don't have control over, but can affect our overall quality, especially high temperature, which will cause the produce maybe to ripen faster than we can get to it in some cases. Frost is another one. And strawberries are a great example. It's gearing up for strawberry season here in Tennessee. And we always have those late frosts that threaten our strawberry crop, and rainy weather at harvest. And what rainy weather generally does close to harvest is it's going to dilute the sugars in your fruits and vegetables. And so that can affect the flavors. High tunnel growers often have an advantage in that arena because they can control how much water gets to the crop. And if you've ever had a high tunnel strawberry, you know that those sugars can really be concentrated in there because of that control you have over the water, and you don't have those overhead rain events. How you grow your crop can also affect its quality. So do you grow on plastic mulch or do you grow on bare ground? And plastic mulch has a lot of advantages for quality because first, it's going to warm up the ground faster than the bare ground will warm up early in the spring. And so you can get a crop in sooner and get it to market sooner. And oftentimes that allows you to set the price. Second of all, it's going to help with weed control. And we know that weeds can be a huge issue on small farms and large farms alike, but on small farms, they can really eat up your labor pretty quickly. So if you have that plastic down, that reduces the weeding that you have to do right in the row of that crop. And the plastic is going to create a barrier for many crops between the crop and the soil. And that can reduce overall plant pathogenic diseases and keeps your product cleaner. And we'll talk about washing later on, but oftentimes if you grow on plastic, that can take out a washing step later on as well. So it can save you time on the back end because you're just going to have a cleaner product that's doesn't have soil adhering to it so much.
I'm gonna interject. So I know that a lot of people, as you just mentioned, there's a lot of benefits to plastic mulch, but a lot of people are hesitant because they're worried about the plastic input, right? And it's just the volume of plastic that they're using.
Sure.
There's some of these biodegradable mulches that are out there. Do you have any comments on the efficacy of those, at all? Or, is it something that works or doesn't work from your perspective?
Sure. I have a lot of comments on that. So that's another area that I study is biodegradable mulch. And I actually work with Carol Miles there at Washington State on a large biodegradable mulch project that we've been working in that area since 2008. What I'll say is that biodegradable mulches can work. If you're a certified organic grower, you need to be careful because they are not The biodegradable plastic mulches are not currently approved through the National Organic Program. So if you're a certified organic grower, the only biodegradable mulch that you could use would be a cellulose or paper product, because it's 100% what we call bio-based, or comes from plant sources, basically. So what we found is that the biodegradable mulches can work quite well depending on the situation and depending on your weed community. So for pumpkins, we found that even the paper mulch, which biodegrades fairly quickly in our area, in about 4 weeks here, we found that that's enough time for the pumpkin to vine out, and it'll do its own weed control after that. So we had very good luck with a paper product here. In Washington, that paper product lasted the entire season basically without breaking down. So again, as we talked about, the environment affects your quality, the environment can affect your biodegradable mulch as well. The plastic mulches, plastic biodegradable mulches, what we found is that in our area, again, we have a big issue with nutsedge, the weed nutsedge. And so nutsedge, just like it can poke through polyethylene plastic, it can also poke through the biodegradable mulches. But again, that paper product for us prevents that nutsedge from poking through. So you really need to know what you're applying it for, and how long you need it to be there, and what crops you're going to use it for. Another issue, which was bigger in Washington State versus Tennessee, was mulch adhesion. So while the crop is sitting on that mulch, the biodegradable mulch, little pieces start to break down and they adhere to the fruit. And at first we thought it was just a phenomenon of larger fruit because we had pumpkins and we've seen it on watermelon, but even on little mini pumpkins that are a ½ pound to 1 pound each, they do get some of that mulch adhesion. And that was a bigger issue up in Washington than it was in the hot, humid Southeast down here. So great question, Faith. The other thing I'll say is that's true that a lot of people don't like the plastic aspect. And what we've seen here in the Southeast, as well as what we use, excuse me, on our own farm, is landscape fabric. And we can use this year after year. So the initial cost starts to balance out over time. It is more expensive than a traditional polyethylene mulch would be, but we can use it from year to year. You just have to have a place to store it and keep it nice and clean and dry in the off season. But the other nice thing about it is we go down the row of the landscape fabric and we burn holes in it just to the spacing that we want, both in row spacing and between row spacing. And then we have that and it's ready to go the next year. So it's a little more labor intensive to burn those holes the first year exactly where we want them. But then we know that one roll might be for tomatoes and one roll might be for cucurbits or something else. So it is a nice system. And I've seen people use landscape fabric for 10 years or more. So it really does last. And we're seeing more folks 5 acres and under that are just covering everything to take the weeds out of the equation because it does do a nice job. All right, so trellising is another cultural practice that can help increase your quality because it's going to allow for better airflow through the plant canopy. And it also helps with the picker because in many cases, they don't have to bend down to try to get something off the ground. Things are more up at waist level or higher. And so trellising can be very effective from both the plant pathology perspective as well as from a labor perspective. I already talked about high tunnels a little bit, but because you have that covering over the crop and you don't have that overhead watering, that's going to help contribute to reduce diseases in your crop. And that will increase your quality overall and your pack out rate. You'll just have a higher marketable yield in a tunnel. And again, because you can control the amount of water, you can also increase the sugars towards right when you're going to harvest by holding back on the water a little bit.
And Annette, we had a question. Is the landscape fabric okay for organic mulching? For like an organic operation?
It absolutely is, yes. And that's another problem with the plastic biodegradable mulch I didn't mention. Like polyethylene, you would have to pull it up at the end of the year. And both polyethylene and biodegradable mulches will leave pieces in the field. So that's the nice thing about landscape fabric. It's thick enough that you can pull it up easily every year, and you're not going to have any issues with organic certification. All right, so tools and equipment. We'll revisit this, I think, in the when we talk about post-harvest things more, but having sharp tools is really important, and clean equipment. So the sharper your knives, that's a great winter activity to make sure all those harvesting knives are really sharp, because that's going to make a cleaner cut on your fruit or vegetable, and it's going to heal over better and have less chance to invite in pathogens. Irrigation practices. So just like with the high tunnel, if we can keep that irrigation right on the ground in like a drip irrigation scenario, that's going to keep the water right in the root zone, not up in the plant canopy, and that's going to reduce the environment in which plant pathogens and even food safety pathogens would flourish, because they need that moisture to proliferate. Lastly, which we're going to dedicate most of our time to, is the post-harvest handling practices. So before we get into the practical post-harvest handling practices, I wanted to give you a little basic lesson in post-harvest handling and some of the principles behind what we do in post-harvest and why we do them. So we're going to talk about respiration, transpiration, temperature, and relative humidity. So just like us, our fruits and vegetables respire. And that respiration is when the food reserves in that fruit or vegetable are oxidized to produce energy to keep the fruit or vegetable alive. So as I mentioned, once you harvest it from the crop, it doesn't have its lifeline anymore. And so how we handle it in post-harvest is going to dictate how quickly it uses up those food reserves. So we want to make sure we're letting it maintain those food reserves for as long as possible. But as it respires after harvest, that's going to result in deterioration of the crop. So it's going to lose nutrients over time, and it's going to experience changes in its texture and flavor, as well as overall weight loss. And if you're selling your crop based on weight, again, that comes back to your bottom line, because the more weight loss it loses, the less money that goes into your pocket. So once harvested, the clock is really ticking, and we want to keep that in mind. So this is a nice graph about the relative respiration rate of different crops and their relative perishability. So the first one, I'm going to throw you an easy one, nuts and dates. As we know, they have a very long shelf life or a very low perishability rate. And the respiration rate is directly correlated to that perishability. So nuts and dates, if we think about them, they're a dry crop, very low moisture in them, so they don't have a lot of weight loss to lose, and we can keep them for a long time because that respiration rate is low. Now I'd like you guys to type in the chat where you think tomatoes, carrots, peaches, garlic, and onions as a group would all fall. So would they fall under low respiration, low perishability, moderate, high, or very high? Don't be shy.
Yeah,
Guessing
don't
is
be
fun.
shy.
If nobody types anything, we're gonna have to randomly call on you. All right, so we have a few guesses in there. We have a guess that tomatoes and peaches would be very high and onions and garlic would be low. Then we have a moderate in there. All right, carrots, low to moderate. Great. So actually all of those are going to be in the moderate category, and the garlic and onions were a little tricky because you might think that they would be a little lower because we can cure them and we can store them for a fairly long time, but they have a moderate respiration rate and moderate perishability rate. All right, let's try the next one. So the next ones on the list are asparagus, sweet corn, and peas. Where do you think they would fall? And now you have three choices: low, high, or very high. I'm seeing some lows, very lows, highs. All right. They're going to be very high. And we see that with asparagus, it can lose its water fairly quickly, even in the refrigerator. And sweet corn is one they always say with the older varieties, you want to boil the water before you go out to pick it because it's going to lose its sugar by the time you get back in the house and get it in the water. So they're all going to have very high respiration rates and very high perishability. All right, another one, apples and potatoes. Where do they fall? We have a low. Oh, that one didn't fool you guys. You're right. Those are low.
They're getting wise.
Low respiration rate and low perishability. And when we think about that, we can store potatoes over the winter. Same thing for apples if we have them in a nice refrigerated storage. So the last category was strawberries and broccoli. They're going to be in the high respiration rate as well as high perishability. And if we think about strawberries, we can see that, right? I might have even guessed if I didn't know that they'd be in that very high category, because if we keep them in ambient conditions for even 1 hour in the field, if we're harvesting and we don't want to go back and stick them in the cooler, we can lose multiple times that in their shelf life by just keeping them in ambient conditions for an hour once they're harvested off the plant. So we want to make sure, especially on this high end, that we're getting things in a cold room or in a cooler really quickly, because it really can affect the shelf life there.
Annette, we have a question. What about leafy greens? Where do they fall in the overall scheme of respiration rate on that chart?
So leafy greens would also be on this high end, and that's because they have so much surface area, right? So each one of those leaves has those stomates on the leaves, and they're respiring individually. So a little bit of weight loss goes a long way in these crops, and so their perishability would be on that very high end as well. Good question. All right, so transpiration, we covered respiration. Transpiration is that process of losing water to the environment. So again, after harvest, produce is no longer taking up water through its roots, and it's now losing any water to the environment or maintaining what it has inside that fruit or vegetable. Just like with respiration, water loss can cause wilting and shriveling and softening, as well as overall weight loss. And we can also lose the crispiness or juiciness and the nutritional quality and flavor of our produce. So we want to be thinking about transpiration as well as respiration. We're going to talk a lot about temperature today and cooling, and that's because temperature is the most important factor in maintaining your quality. So if you don't currently have a cooler set up on your farm, that might be a really good investment for you to make, because it is really the most important factor in maintaining your quality and your shelf life of your product. So first, we want to remove or we want to prevent field heat from building up in the crop as much as possible. We want to remember that all of these crops are alive, so any heat they experience after we harvest them is going to increase their water loss and their respiration, and it's going to reduce that overall storage life and quality. The higher your storage temperature, the shorter your shelf life. And this is a great example. I'm sure we've all seen this in our refrigerator from time to time, maybe. This one on the top is botrytis, and that'll grow even at refrigeration temperature. And it's one that gets into strawberries, what we call a latent infection. So they can be infected with botrytis before there's really much of a berry there at the flowering stage. But then as it begins to decay, this can take over after harvest. This one, hairy one down here, is called rhizopus, and it's a great indicator if strawberries were temperature abused, because it's not going to grow at normal refrigeration temperatures. It's going to grow around 10 C or about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's one's always a really good indicator that somewhere along the line, these strawberries did not stay cold because they have that hairy rhizopus on them.
Hey, Annette, this is Craig. I've got a question about cooling and refrigeration. I was attending a seminar yesterday where the guy is adapting principles of lean to the farm. And he's gotten to the point where most of his customers are within a couple miles. So he does no refrigeration and he gets it to his customers right away, figuring they'll pay for it and it's okay. But our customers aren't as close, but I've always believed that you get the heat out as quickly as you can, and that's going to extend the shelf life, even if it's a matter of a few hours. So I feel conflicted about his idea of just get it delivered. I still think it's helpful to get the heat out right away. Do you have any comments on that?
I agree with you. It is helpful to get the heat out right away. And if he can harvest everything early in the morning and get it right to the customers, that would be one thing. And if he's only harvesting one crop in particular, that might be one thing. But in a situation where you might be running a CSA or taking a diverse mix of things to the market, that gets really tricky because you can't harvest everything at once. So really, like I said, having a cooler on the farm is a really good investment. And we'll talk about some of those options coming up, but it doesn't have to be a really expensive endeavor. And I think that's where people get bogged down because they think, this is going to cost me thousands and thousands of dollars. And it doesn't necessarily need to go there. So yeah, that's a great question, but I totally agree with you. Even getting a little bit of field heat out can go a long way.
Thank you.
All right, so these are some examples from back in my grad school days. As you can tell by these were actual slides that I took photos of, but I think they're a great representation of what can happen with different temperature storage. All of these temperatures are degrees Celsius, not degrees Fahrenheit, but you can see after 7 days in storage, here's our broccoli stored at 0 or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Here it is at 5, here it is at 10. We start to see a little bit of difference, but by the time I get to that 14 or 20 degrees storage, which would be around 70, you see that broccoli, all those florets are already yellowing up. We start to get those off odors, and it's just not broccoli we want to eat. So this is a great example of what proper temperature can do for something like broccoli that would also be highly respiring. Here's some apples, since we're talking to Washington folks. You're the Washington capital there. So in this case, these apples were inoculated with Aspergillus, a post-harvest pathogen. You can see the little mark there at the top. If we kept these apples at 5 degrees, this is for 2 weeks now, we don't see that infection growing any. Same thing for 10 degrees or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. However, when we get to 20 C or 68 Fahrenheit, you see that rot spot has really progressed just by having it at room temperature. And then it gets even worse if it gets up to 86 or 104. That whole apple is gone there.
And
so this
Annette,
is another good example. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll also interject to tie in, like, as the microbiologist, what we know is that, ultimately, once rot starts to happen, even if you're culling, you're not sending rotten apples clearly to market or rotten anything to market. If they're commingled with marketable produce, what we know is that essentially these sorts of rots let the door open to some of the nasty stuff like salmonella and listeria and Shiga toxigenic E. coli, so that they get access to nutrients, and then they can start to grow. And then, so it's just kind of giving them a little bit of an opportunity that they need to make that perfect storm for a growth scenario where you can make people sick. And then essentially they just transfer on to marketable fruit when you're trying to cull them out. So that's always one thing that's really important to remember. It's not only your bottom line, it can also be definitely hand in hand with food safety there.
That's a great point. Same thing with bagged lettuce. When you start to see that bacterial soft rot in your bagged lettuce products, or not even bagged, in your heads of lettuce, they've done studies that show that those can also be tied to those foodborne illness pathogens too. So great point. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about is relative humidity. So this is the degree to which the air is saturated with water vapor. And our rate of water loss is going to depend on the difference in that relative humidity between the intercellular structure, the inside of our fruit or vegetable, and that surrounding air. So that water is going to tend to go from more water to less water, right? So this is going to depend on the surface characteristics of the produce. And we talked about that a little bit when we were talking about the perishability rate and the leafy greens. So the surface area of leafy greens is very high, right? Because each one of those leaves has area that can lose water to the surrounding air. If we're thinking about something like a tomato or an apple, they have that protective skin on them. And really the only place where they're going to lose water is through the stem scar or the blossom scar in many cases. And it's fairly well healed in an apple. So that's why we can keep those for so long. In a tomato, that blossom scar is going to be fresh right after we pick it, and it's fairly large. So it's a place where we can lose water, but it's not going to be like something like lettuce. So for most vegetable crops, because most fruit and vegetable crops are about 90 to 95% water to start with, we want to maintain the relative humidity to a high level, so 80 to 95%. That's going to give us a longer shelf life, but we want to be careful because that again can encourage disease, both plant pathogen and foodborne illness, because it's giving them that moisture that they need to also proliferate. However, cool temperature and sanitation can help prevent that. So they go hand in hand. And in some cases, folks use, if you don't have a formal relative humidity set up on your farm, some people do use humidifiers in their cooler or put buckets of water in there. But again, we want to make sure we're maintaining a safe environment and we're not causing other pathogens to grow. All right, so now we're going to jump back to some of the practical things that everybody can do on their farm. The first one is, when is it time to harvest? Generally, most crops are going to be harvested based on their size or the maturity that you desire. And many crops are actually going to have better quality and shelf life if we pick them slightly immature. So if we harvest them too early, they're going to have insufficient size and they might not have all their sugars developed or their vitamin content developed. And if we harvest them too late, think of something like okra, they're going to have too much fiber and the tendency to convert that sugar back into starch. So sweet corn's a good example of that. If we leave it on the plant too long, it's going to have less sugar, be more starchy, what we call field corn. And then it can also decrease your plant productivity, because the purpose of the plant really is not to produce fruits and vegetables for us, but it's to produce seed for that plant to continue on its progeny. So if you're harvesting late and those seeds are becoming mature in the fruit or the vegetable, that's going to tell the plant, I've done my job, I can shut down, I don't need to produce anymore. Also, if we're harvesting late, it has the potential to attract pests into the field. So we want to be aware of that as well. So here on the left-hand side, we have a list of crops that we generally pick immature. Green bell pepper, cucumbers, and summer squash. If we actually pick those when they would be mature, they would, like the cucumber would be big and yellow. We've all seen those when we miss one under a vine on a given day, and we come back and it's huge like a club. And it also gets that bitter flavor in there. So these are what we want to pick immature, as well as snap beans and sweet peas and okra, as I already mentioned, and eggplant and sweet corn. The things we pick mature or vine ripe generally are going to be tomatoes, unless you're doing green tomatoes and gassing them to get them red. And that's again from a shipping perspective. Red peppers, muskmelon and cantaloupe and watermelon, and then winter squash and pumpkin. And these are important to pick mature because, especially for winter squash and pumpkin, when they're mature, that rind is going to harden, and that's going to help maintain them throughout the winter so we can store them for a longer amount of time. And then dry beans.
We have a question. What about potatoes as far as maturity?
So potatoes, you're going to pick them when they're mature as well. So potatoes are a little different because it's not the fruit itself that we're picking. All of these here are true fruits, so they have seeds in them. When we're talking about the true vegetables, that's going to be a little different because the potato is a modified stem, right? It's not a true fruit. So that you're going to pick when it's at the size that you desire for whatever variety that it might be. But good question. Yeah, these are all botanically true fruits, even though we call some of them vegetables. Things that produce seeds. All right. This is another tip or trick. For some of our root crops like carrots and beets and turnips, they can be left in the ground through the winter if they're properly mulched, 1 to 2 inches thick, and if your soil doesn't freeze solid. So this works fairly well for us in Tennessee because it's very rare that we would have our soil freeze solid. It might work for parts of Washington, but maybe not all of Washington. And it also doesn't work if your field is prone to flooding, because we know if your field floods, that's considered an adulterated crop and we can't put it into the food system. So we certainly don't want these root crops out in the field, and then we get a flood, whether expected or unexpected, and we can no longer sell those crops. But if you can leave them in the ground, those cool temperatures can really improve the flavor of these crops. And we have a winter CSA here in Middle Tennessee that grows a ½ acre of carrots, and that's exactly what they do. They leave them in the ground until they're ready to put them right into their CSA boxes. And these are the sweetest carrots that you will ever taste. They're wonderful carrots. And it's that planting window, and then they get those cool temps in the field. So a few more harvesting tips. If possible, we want to harvest in the morning hours. We talked about not letting that field heat build up. And if you can prevent that field heat from getting in the crop, the better off you'll be, because the plant and the fruit or vegetable will have the most turgor in those morning hours. It's been soaking up water from the soil and the roots all night. As the sun comes out, the respiration of the whole plant and the transpiration increases. And so it's going to start losing water as a plant. It's going to draw some out of those fruits and vegetables. If we can harvest in the morning hours, we're preventing that heat from building up, and we're going to have the most weight. Again, if you're selling things by weight, they're going to weigh the most in the morning than throughout the day. The caveat to that is we also want to try to harvest when the canopy is dry. So if things are dewy, then we have a higher chance of spreading, again, both plant pathogens and foodborne illness pathogens from one fruit to the next. I realize these are totally in contradiction of each other generally, but you have to do what makes sense for your operation. So if you can harvest in the morning hours, that's great. If you can give them a little time for that condensation, if they have any, to come off, that's even better, because that free moisture can really contribute to decay over time.
Annette, I've got a question on
Go ahead.
on harvest tips. I've not been through a lot of education for post-harvest, but I thought I heard somewhere that if a product hits the ground and it's not coming out of the ground, that you can't then use it, or it's somehow violated safe handling. So take, for example, a tomato. If a tomato falls off, and it could be onto dirt or it could be onto ground cover, fabric, is that then something you can't put into commerce, or is that, that seems a little bit ridiculous, but I'd like your answer there.
Sure, great question. So the FDA did put out a fact sheet on that a year or two ago. And the thinking there is, if we think about the tomato again, if the tomato falls into the row where we're walking, that there could be contaminants there from workers walking through there, right? So that's the thinking behind, if it falls on the ground, that we don't want to put it into commerce. Some of these things, as we know, grow directly on the ground. So that's where people say, wait a minute, I'm growing squash or I'm growing pumpkins and they're laying on the ground and then I'm harvesting them. So how's that different from a tomato? If it falls on the ground, why can't I pick it up? But that's the thinking. If it gets in that row, there could be contaminants from people's boots or something like that. And Faith, if you want to add anything to that, please feel free.
Yeah, I get it, right? Like if you're sitting there managing your farm and all these diverse crops, and you have anything from root crops to vines that are definitely, in contact with the ground, and then you're like, but wait, if the tomato just falls off, it's no bueno. And right now, from the produce safety rule perspective, that is the case. And they've even gone out a bit and said, not only if it drops from the plant, but even if it's like a steak tomato and the tomatoes actually droop down to where they're touching the soil, and that wasn't intended to be the case, then that's also that's considered drop produce. So I would say for those of you who have to adhere to the produce safety rule, that is definitely the FDA's perspective, and they set the bar. I think they're still kind of reevaluating this and trying to get more clear messaging around it. But as Annette mentioned, yeah, their perspective is that the ground has not been managed to have contact with that crop. Whereas if it was a vine or clearly a root crop, it has been managed in such a way to prevent cross-contamination with some of our foodborne pathogens. So, yep, you heard correctly, Craig. And I put in the chat box the FDA's fact sheet on dropped. The wording here is a little weird. They call it drop covered produce. That doesn't mean produce grown in high tunnels. That means produce that's covered under the produce safety rule.
Great, thank you. Great question, Craig. All right, so the next one is keep the produce out of the sun. And that's really important, again, for not getting that field heat built up in there. It makes a huge difference just if it's in the shade or in the sun till you can get it back to the cooler. Of course, we want to handle everything with care because bruising is going to reduce our quality. It also can invite in some of these decay organisms that we talked about, as well as if there are foodborne illness contaminants there. If we get a bruise, then that area could be opened up and we could have some free sugars roaming around there for them to utilize. We want to move everything to cold storage as soon as possible. And again, this is going to depend on how many people work on your farm, how far your field is from cold storage, if you have it, and what crop you're growing. But the faster you can get it to cold storage, again, you're buying yourself shelf life on the other end. We don't want to mingle that damaged produce with high quality produce, as Faith mentioned at the beginning. We also want to use clean and sanitized harvest bins. And we don't want to handle things any more than we absolutely have to. And we'll talk a little bit more about field packing as well. So after going over those harvest tips, what do you see that's good about this photo here? And what might not be so great about it? You can type it in the chat or unmute and yell it out. Anyone? There we go. Things are in the shade.
Yeah.
Yep. Good to be out of the sun, but that's not so great.
Stacked on top of each other, so that I said they're stacked on top of each other.
Yep. That could be an issue. I think they're actually in layers, but that trailer, the way it's designed, it would be hard to get them back out of there if they're not, that top layer isn't directly on top of there. What else is not so good about this? How do they get them in the shade? What are they shading them with?
Well, stuff falling out of the tree, I mean, it's possible, but.
Exactly. We could have birds in the tree. We could have squirrels in the tree. So that introduces the possibility that we could have some fecal contamination depending on what's going on there. So while we want them in the shade, we want to be mindful of how we're putting them in the shade and make sure that we're not introducing a potential food safety issue when we have them in the shade as well. All right, so field packing. Field packing really helps to reduce the steps in your handling chain, and that can reduce your overall potential damage. So if you're not picking things up, moving them around, putting them in one container, taking them to another container, that can really go a long way to reduce your compression damage and abrasions and impact. And it's really great for your berries and also your leafy crops if we just touch them once and that's it. So here we have a couple of strawberry operations. And you can see these pickers have these little tables that they're picking into, which can help with your labor as well. Make it easier on your pickers. Another scenario is a small cart over here, but you see these were picked directly into the baskets that they're going to be sold into. So they're never going to be touched again, except by the customer when they're buying them, right? The other thing that this helps, this little cart here, is it's going to reduce contact of the container with soil. And again, you're saying, but these came out of the soil. So why do we need to reduce contact? We don't want to get that soil directly on the crop if we can help it. So the cart can go a long way for that. On the right-hand side, there is what we use at our farm. We have these carts that we got at the local farm store, and they're great because we can fit a lot of bins in them, and we can just roll them right down the field as we go and harvest into them, and they can hold a lot. So nobody has to lug that full bin of cabbages back to our packing house. They're right there in the cart, and it makes it a little easier on everybody.
Hey, Annette, do you know like do those carts have a special name, or I know for the one that you said you just bought it you can buy those at pretty much any farm store or like online, but for the ones that are more crop specific, like the red one that you showed, do those have a special name, or would you just look for them in like a supply store?
Yeah, I would just look in a supply. Those would be specific to strawberry because they're not going to hold a whole lot on that side. Maybe strawberry harvest cart.
Yeah, I'll try and find it. I'll do some Googling online, put it in the chat if I can find it.
Perfect. All right, so shade and mobility. This can look a lot of different ways. It could be something here in the top left corner where you have a cart that has kind of wings that open up that'll shade not only the product, but also your workers in the field, which the workers appreciate in the middle of summer, to give them some shade as well. Down here, of course, we don't want to mingle our produce with our cows, but this is just another example of an economical place where you could have a shade structure on your farm. So this is basically, although it's more than 4 sticks, it's what we would call 4 sticks and a lid, because it just has that roof and the poles to hold it up. But that would give you a lot of area on your farm. And again, an economical choice. We use our golf cart a lot in tandem with that cart that I just showed you. It can go right on the back of our golf cart, and that way we can get things to our packing house faster because we're not walking it, we're driving it. The thing you want to think about if you are using one of these golf carts in tandem with a full cart of produce on the back is you want to make sure your workers are driving carefully and slowly. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of damage bumping up and down. And we have our interns that like to do things quickly sometimes, but we don't want them to do this quickly. We want them to take their time so we're not getting abrasion damage on the bumps and things. Another option is pop-up tents. So a lot of folks use these when they go to the farmer's market, but you could use it right on your farm to keep, again, your workers and your product shaded. We use these a lot on our farm and when we're doing trials with vegetables, and they work really well to keep the product out of the sun. And again, a really economical option. You can have several in a line, depending on how much crop you need to keep out of the sun. And they're very easy to move around by hand. This other one is a trailer, much like that apple trailer we just saw, but a little wider layers in between so you can get the boxes in and out. Of course, that top layer is not going to have protection besides the lid of the box, but the lid of the box can also go a long way. So that's a great option if you do have a product that you have lids on the boxes. And this is another example where they're picking it and they're getting it right out of the field. I also like that they have this little cardboard box to set these other boxes down on so they're not directly on the ground. All right, now we're going to delve into pre-cooling. And we're going to spend some time here because, again, cooling is really important. Most folks are probably going to use room cooling, and we're going to spend the most time on that. But we're going to talk about these other types of cooling as well: forced air cooling, hydro cooling, vacuum cooling, and top or liquid icing. So this is a chart from the On-Farm Infrastructure Toolkit, and I have the link here at the bottom of the slide but also in the resources slide at the end. This is really an invaluable resource. This is an appendix in the back, but there's lots of information from this publication. It comes from the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association and the North Carolina Growing Together folks. But really a wealth of information about cooling is in this publication, different types of insulation, different sizes of air conditioners you might use for cooling, other topics on refrigeration, but lots of information on storage as well. And I like this appendix and this table because it shows the difference in time that some of these different cooling methods can take. So if we look at apples, and they have a general time frame for room cooling versus forced air versus hydro cooling and ice cooling. And that's of course going to vary, again, depending on the produce, the volume, the structure of that produce and the size of that produce, right? So it's not going to take, if we look down here at beans, it's not going to take as long to cool down a bean with its thin little diameter as it would an apple. So keep that in mind. But I like this because it gives you that general idea of the differences in time of these different cooling methods. So room cooling, while it can be the easiest to set up, is the one that's going to take the longest. So you can see here, they ballparked it from 20 to 100 hours. And it's also going to depend on the temperature you're starting out, the temperature that fruit or vegetable is starting out, and how low you want to cool it, right? So if you never built up very much field heat, it's going to take a shorter amount of time. If it's 105 when you're harvesting and that fruit is about 80 or 90 degrees that you just harvested, it's going to take longer because you're trying to get more heat out of it to get it down to these ideal holding temperatures there on the right-hand side.
Annette, this is Craig. I've got a question again. What difference does it make if it's wet and you have evaporation as part of the equation? You know, you're going to put green beans in, they're going to be dry, but you put leafy greens in, they're going to be wet. How is the chilling time affected by evaporation?
So it will be affected. If it's wet, it's going to tend to help it cool faster. And that's why some of these others, while they're more of a drench than just the surface being wet, the wetness can actually help cool it faster. That's not to say that we want to get everything wet, but if there is condensation on there, or if it's a product that you did wash, that wetness can contribute to it cooling faster. However, once we put it in a cooler, until it gets down to that cold temperature that we're trying to reach, that can help decay organisms. And if you've ever been to a food safety class with Faith, I'm sure some of you have, you know that if there are foodborne illness bacteria on a plant or something, for example, or a fruit or vegetable, that if there's a bacterium on there, it can divide in 20 minutes. So if we're in a room cooling situation and we have that free moisture, while it can help cool it a little faster, it could also contribute to decay or foodborne illness pathogen proliferating there. So we want to make sure we have that balance there.
Well,
yeah, unless it's something that we're specifically hydro cooling or ice cooling.
Will you talk about different means of washing? Because if you put like Sanidate or something in it, then presumably that wouldn't be an issue.
Right. And Faith is going to do a deep dive on that next week.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So we'll talk about that more. I'll talk about it a little bit, but that's what next week's focus is really going to be on, those sanitizers and how to best use them.
And
great question.
I'll chime in also when it comes to, like, from the food safety perspective, we know you really need to keep the relative humidity high, especially when you're going into cold storage. Really where we see the worst situations occur is connected to condensation. And it's condensation actually in the cooler, right? So you may have it gathering on the ceiling of a cooler and then dripping down, or from like a catch pan or something along those lines in our more sophisticated, cooling units. Be mindful of that and take care of that, and do not let that proliferate. And so, well, you may be thinking, well, how do I stop it? Well, you wipe it down. It takes time and it takes management, but in essence, you're taking away that free water on that surface to act as a cross-contamination point. And that's where we see some of our worst offenders when it comes to cooler cross-contamination with some of these pathogens that can hang out in there.
And sometimes you might have, a certain spot in the cooler that has that issue. And while we do want to wipe it down, if you know it's just one area of the cooler, you want to avoid that area. Don't put anything under it that's going to be in the food chain. All right, so if we look back at apples, if we just stick them in a room, it's going to take a while. It's going to take hours, right? 20 to 100 hours to cool them down to that ideal holding temperature. The ideal holding temperature for apples would generally be around 32. If we use forced air, which is putting a fan in there and drawing the air through, we're going to reduce that by quite a bit, right? It's going to take it down to 1 to 10 hours for forced air cooling. If we use water, which is not commonly done with apples generally, that's going to reduce it even further to 0.1 to 1 hour. And then if we used ice, again, not done with apples, it's going to be less than an hour to cool it down. So that just shows you the difference in timing, but all of these methods have their pros and cons, and we'll talk about those a little bit more. So room cooling. Cold rooms are going to help with your shelf life from hours to weeks. And generally with any method of the pre-cooling that you use, once it gets down to that temperature, you're still going to put it in a cold room to maintain it until you're taking it to market generally. So it's kind of a two-part system. While you can just stick things in a room and let them cool, depending on your crop, and if you're only growing one crop and there's a better method to cool it down initially, you might want to invest in that technology, and then you would still have a room to put it in once it reaches that temperature. So room cooling is generally always going to be in the equation, unless you're just trying to get field heat out and you're like the person Craig mentioned earlier, they're getting it directly to their customers quick, so they don't think they have to do any cold room sort of scenario. If it's quick, you might cool it down and get it off the farm, but you still want to take that time to cool it. So for a room cooler, you want to make sure that it's large enough to handle any projected backups of product. So think about the most product that you might have at any given time. And you also want it to be large enough not only to handle that projected backup, but the better airflow you have, the better cooling job it's going to do, right? So we've all seen our refrigerators get packed up. If we don't have good airflow in a cooler situation, we're not going to have the same cooling effect. Generally, we're going to have better cooling if we have good airflow in that whole system. Room cooling can look a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be a brand new cooler. It can be used. It can be an old truck that you're repurposing into your cooler. It could be a room that you already have on your farm that you're repurposing, insulating to make it into a cold room. There are lots of options, and growers are very resourceful. So you can DIY any old shipping container or railway car and build a cold room using a CoolBot. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. And this is another example, one of my old slides again. For room cooling, if our initial product temperature was 75 degrees, so not really too high, we're going to get that initial cooling in our cold room in about 20 minutes. So we're going to get it down to 55 in about 20 minutes. However, that's the quick part of it. It's going to take another 80 minutes to get it down to that 35 degrees in a room situation. So this is just another example of how room cooling can take. This is like an example of one piece of produce in a scenario where that cooling time is going to take over an hour to get to. So it's going to go quickly at first, and then we're going to see that drop off over time to get down to our desired temperature. This is just an example of room cooling. You'll see here what they did nicely is they stacked these boxes where you can still get airflow in between the boxes instead of jamming them all close up against each other. And so that helps in this situation. So I talked about the CoolBot, and some folks just use an air-conditioned room for cooling and use that air conditioner as their cooler. The advantage of that, of course, is it's low cost and it's easy to install a window air conditioning unit. However, if you try to cool your product below about 60 degrees or the minimum setting on that air conditioner, your coils are going to freeze up. And for those that are electrically inclined, they can overcome this, but it's going to be cumbersome to rig up the air conditioner to bypass that. And it can be hard to maintain that low temperature. And I should say that all of these slides I'm going to show you are from John Wilhoit, who is an engineer at the University of Kentucky for many years. And he did a lot of work with CoolBots and a lot of great work with them. So a CoolBot is an easy way to overcome that limitation of the air conditioner or override that minimum setting of the air conditioner. And it's from Store It Cold. And I have the link to their webpage at the end of this presentation as well. But the basic unit is about $350, and then you need to buy that AC unit as well. There's a newer CoolBot Pro, and it has Wi-Fi connectivity and a mobile app, so you can run it right from your phone. If you headed off to the farmer's market and wanted to turn down the temperature, you could do that from your phone. It's going to be about $50 more, so right around $400, and then the AC unit. But the way that it works, it's going to prevent that freeze up by cycling the compressor on and off based on your readings of the room temperature and frost on those cooling coils. And it basically fools the air conditioner temperature sensor because it has a little tiny micro heater on it. So you can cool a room down to 33 degrees if you have enough capacity within that AC unit. And that's where that infrastructure publication that I mentioned will come in handy for the size of a room you want to cool. It gives you dimensions of how much the capacity of the air conditioner that you'll need. The other nice thing about the CoolBot is it has those simple digital controls on it and the readout, and it's really easy to install. So here's the readout on the CoolBot, and it gives you a few more tips on this slide. That it works best with AC units with plastic temperature sensors. The metal temperature sensors don't work as well. And you're going to use that air conditioner unit without its filter and front grill on it, as you can see here. And then you just insert the frost sensor into the fins, and it's going to free the AC temperature sensor. And then you attach that little CoolBot micro heater to it. And it really only takes a few minutes to install. This is what we used for many years on our farm. You saw our packing house renovation last week, but we used this for probably about 10 years before we did that packing house renovation, and it worked just fine for us. It was in a room that had cinder blocks in it, but it maintained the temperature very well.
Annette, I can also testify to how wonderful this system is. It's basically the reason that I'm still in business, because I was able to build a couple of, 11 by 11 foot coolers and just use an air conditioner, and it's just a brilliant system.
Great, thanks, Edith. So if you don't already have a low-cost cold room, John Wilhoit also put together some slides on that. So oftentimes we have a building on the farm that we're not using that we could repurpose, or a room somewhere that we could repurpose. But if you don't, this low-cost cold room is constructed from readily available building materials, and the dimensions of it is 8 by 10 by 8 feet tall. So it's large enough to get a lot of stuff in, but small enough that you can fit it into another covered space. So a barn or another farm building that you might have. He constructed the floors and ceiling and the walls using 2x6 or 2x4 studs, and then plywood sheathing inside and out. And then the floors, walls, and ceiling were insulated with batt insulation and foam board to an R value of 19. And that R value for insulation just means the higher the R value, the more effective the insulation capabilities are. Since this is a cooler, they use vapor barrier on the outside, the hotter side of the constructed walls. So we didn't, to prevent that condensation that Faith was talking about. So here's a picture of that cold room, partially constructed there. You can see the foam board insulation on the outside there and some of that plywood sheathing. Here's the whole box, and they have the foam board that was taped at the joints and that vapor barrier on the outside. Then he puts it on skids, and that's really smart. So you can drag it around more easily if you need to, or you could even lift it with a large forklift. And they had a picture that I didn't include in here where they were putting it on the back of a trailer with a big forklift. So that's nice to think about the mobility if it's not just going to be where it is when you build it. Good to think about. And then here it is, ready to go with a little door on it. You could put a little ramp on the outside so you can easily get in and out with a load. You could change the door on it if you need it bigger to get in and out of there as well. And here's the inside of it with the CoolBot installed in there. This is a slide with all of his costs to make this. And it came out with the CoolBot on there. This is from 2009, and this is in Kentucky. So you have to have some inflation on there for 2021. But at the time, it came in just under $2,500. So not a bad investment at all for a farm. And the link to his entire presentation is also at the end of these slides. So you can get more information if you're interested in building something like this. Some additional considerations you wanted to mention, like we talked about last week, a floor drain might be something that you'd want to have in there so you can really clean it out well and drain it. Floor insulation, and there's another slide on that. An alternative to bat insulation, and there's a couple slides on that as well, or just an alternative structure like repurposing, oh, the name of it just flew out of my head, but a pre-made, either a pre-made shed or a shipping container. There we go, shipping container. Whew. And then low-cost methods for forced air cooling. So this is why you might want to think about floor insulation. It's going to improve your efficiency if you're using the cooler for very cold temperatures. So if you're trying to get below that 55 degrees, then if your soil is at 55 degrees or the ground is at 55 degrees, it's going to draw heat into that cooler if the cooler is below 55 degrees. If your cold room is less than 55 degrees, you're going to lose some of that coolness to the ground if you don't have good floor insulation. So that's why you might want to think about the floor insulation. If you want to use foam board instead of bat insulation, there are some disadvantages of bat insulation. It's going to lose much of its insulating value if it happens to get wet. And it can harbor mold if it gets wet as well. So you want to keep that in mind. Foam board is a good alternative. It's going to have an R value of 5 per inch of thickness. And so a 4-inch thickness is not going to fit well in a 2x4 stud wall. However, you could put it in that stud wall and then fill in with spray and insulation to seal it as well. It's also going to add an additional $500 to $600, again, from a few years ago, for the equivalent insulating value of bat insulation. But it is another option, and more folks are using foam board as their insulation. There's a couple types of foam board. There's expanded polystyrene. It's going to be the cheapest but least used foam board product on the market. It's going to give you an R value of about 4 per inch of thickness. So you need several layers to get up to that R value around 19 that the bat insulation gave you. And then there's also the extruded polystyrene foam. It's XPS. It's also known as blue board or pink board, and it comes in different thicknesses. And so it's more widely used foam board product in residential construction, it's going to have a little higher R value, so around 5. And it's going to be a little more expensive, but a little more widely used. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about forced air cooling. And this is where you use a fan in the cold room to pull that air through a package of produce. And it's very commonly used in strawberries because, again, strawberries are such a perishable product. We want to get that field heat out very quickly and then maintain it right around 32 degrees to prevent that botrytis from growing, but also to maintain our quality and shelf life overall. So you would put this tarp down, and then the fan is on this other end, and it's just going to draw that air through all of these boxes as it goes. If you are doing an application where you're using forced air cooling, it's important that you have the right type of boxes too. As you can see here with this great box, there's the holes in the side, and that's because if you're investing in that forced air, you want to make sure that the air is actually getting into the box and not getting stopped there at the cardboard. So another consideration is your packaging if you're using forced air cooling. With any berry crop, forced air cooling is a good option. So if you're just growing berries, there are some resources at the end as well of making a small forced air cooler on your farm. There's one from NC State and also I think from the USDA in the resources. Hydro cooling is when we're showering the produce with chilled water. This is definitely not suitable for all vegetables. We don't want to do this with any berries because this would decrease the shelf life. Even though it would initially cool them down quickly, it's going to have that free moisture, and there's all those little nooks and crannies on berries that are going to hold that water, and we're not going to be able to dry them out. So berries are a great example that we want to keep dry. We don't want any water on them till the customer gets home and is going to eat them, just like in the package. This is an example of celery hydro cooling. So just giving it a shower. Again, you need to think about your package. If you're hydro cooling, you want to have holes for that water to get back out, and you have to have a wax box. Otherwise, you're going to have a mushy box pretty quickly. Here's another example of hydro cooling. This is from Ohio. And this was greens that they're cooling in their hydro cooler there. And this is just an example of a gargantuan hydro cooler from California. So most folks are not on this scale, but I just wanted to show you that, to show you how big these can actually get. Vacuum cooling is going to be the most expensive type of cooling, and we don't see it very often unless, again, someone's growing one commodity and has the money to invest in it, but it's also going to be the fastest. So it's going to force water to evaporate to remove the heat. This is another one that's good for leafy crops. And this is an example of a big old vacuum cooler, also from California. So you put you put 3 pallets in that vacuum cooler, and then you shut it down, get the heat out, and then take it to the cold room to store it. All right, so this is a slide that shows you the effect of vacuum cooling on weight loss, which is the other reason that vacuum cooling can be tricky for most folks, because it's going to take that moisture, as it said, right out of your crop to help cool it down. And so depending again on how much you need to cool that product down, if we're just cooling it down a few degrees here at this end, so like 10 degrees, we're not going to lose much weight, right? We're probably at 1% or less of weight loss. But if we need to get a lot of heat out of that product, if we're cooling it down, say from 100 degrees down to 40 degrees, we're going to lose about 6% of that product weight while we're cooling it down with a vacuum cooler. So again, a good reason not to let that field heat build up in the first place, because the longer it takes with any of these, you're going to lose more weight of that product, but you're really going to lose it in a vacuum cooler situation. The last one is top or liquid icing. And this is just crushed ice or a slurry that's added to the container on top of the produce. This is commonly used for sweet corn and broccoli. And I have a couple of pictures of that. Here they're putting an ice slurry into a box of broccoli. Again, you need a nice wax box for that, or you'll have a mushy box pretty quickly. And this is an example of why it works so well for broccoli. So just the nature, the physiology of that broccoli, the broccoli is those little flower florets at the top that we eat. And it's actually hard to cool because of all that airspace in between those florets. With this ice slurry mixture, it really gets in there and transfers that cool to the broccoli quickly. And that's why it's used in broccoli. All right, we don't want to use icing on every crop. So on the left-hand side are crops that can be iced. So you'll notice these are a lot of our true vegetables, asparagus and beets and broccoli and carrots and cauliflower and green onions and leafy greens and radishes and spinach. And then we do have a few fruiting vegetables in there. So cantaloupes as well as sweet corn and watermelon can be iced. These are the things that we never want to ice because they can be damaged by direct contact with ice. So all of our berries and many of our fruiting vegetables are in there, as well as garlic and onions.
And I'll mention, Annette, on the food safety front, if you have some commodities you've chosen to ice and you have others that you're not, make sure that you're staging those in your cooler or wherever you're staging them at, so that basically as the ice melts, it's not dripping down onto whatever's below. So make it the lowest thing. And then if they're just sitting on a pallet, like getting staged, ready to be sent out, have them in a room that has a drain, right? Because that's the other thing we don't want, is a bunch of standing water that people are going to track through and just give you more headaches than you want.
Great points, thanks. All right, so now we're going to spend a little time on chilling injury, and this one's important because not all fruits and vegetables are best stored at 32 degrees. For a lot of them, that's going to be the temperature that gives us our longest shelf life, but some are going to be best stored between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. And here again, both time and temperature are going to determine the extent of that chilling injury. So if you're sticking something in a cooler that's colder than 45 degrees, just for an hour or two until you're taking it to the market to get that field heat out, it's going to be fine. If you're sticking it in there for a couple days, then you'll start to see chilling injury symptoms, which I'll show you in a second. The highly sensitive crops to chilling injury are going to be basil, and I'm sure you've all seen that in the refrigerator from time to time, that turns black after it's in the refrigerator because of chilling injury. Cucumbers and eggplant, pumpkins and summer squash and okra and sweet potatoes. And then we have moderately sensitive crops like snap beans and muskmelon and peppers and winter squash and tomatoes. And I think most folks are aware we don't want our tomatoes in the refrigerator. We want to keep them on the counter because not only do they get chilling injury, it just makes them mushy and flavorless. Here are some of those chilling injury symptoms on beans and on cucumber. We're going to see pitting like we see here, or skin blemishes, or internal discoloration, or an overall failure to ripen. So if it's something that we picked when it wasn't completely mature, we're going to stop that ripening process if we hold it in a temperature colder than it can take. It's also going to increase the susceptibility to decay. So it goes against exactly what we're trying to do, is giving ourselves that longest shelf life. The failure to ripen can be a benefit in some cases. Not that anybody's growing bananas, but in bananas, you've probably seen chilling injury in the grocery store. If you look at a banana and it looks like it's gray just under the skin, that's a sign that those bananas were stored too cold at some point. However, if you take bananas home that don't already have chilling injury, because they won't ripen properly in most cases, but if you take your bananas home and they're starting to get to this stage that you really like and you don't want them to get all those brown spots on them, you can stick them in the refrigerator then and it'll stop them from ripening further. The skin will turn black because of that chilling injury, but the inside of the banana will be at the stage it was when you stuck it in the refrigerator. So a good tip if you're sick of making banana bread out of your old bananas. All right, so washing. Faith's going to talk a lot more about this next week, but washing prior to marketing is essential for many of our fruits and vegetables. We need to make sure that we have a plentiful source of clean, potable water, so no generic E. coli in that water. And we want to make sure that we're changing that water often. And it's one of those ambiguous terms, change the water often, because it's going to vary depending on what you're washing, how soiled it is, and how much you're putting through that system, right? So for things like root crops, you might need brushes to help get that bulk of soil off. For leafy greens, if you do wash them, you want to make sure that they get really thoroughly spun dry or drained before you're bagging and storing them. Better yet, don't get them wet. If you can tell your customers, hey, we didn't wash this because we want you to have the longest shelf life, we want you to wash it when you get home, right before you're going to use it. Most customers understand that now. We're used to that with strawberries and other types of berries. And that's what we tell people for our CSA, that we didn't wash them, so they'll last the longest for you when you get them home. We don't want to wash any damaged or diseased produce. Again, that can be a manner in which we're spreading contamination around or cross-contaminating other products, especially if we're dunking things to wash them. And if you are washing, your water should have a sanitizer in there. And I'm not going to talk too much more about that and steal Faith's thunder for next week. I will say, though, that bacteria can enter the stem scar if you don't have the proper wash water temperature or you improperly handle it. So here's a big dump tank of green tomatoes, again in California. We want to make sure that if you are dunking produce in water, that fruit pulp must be less than 10 degrees warmer than the water temperature to prevent infiltration. And I just talked to you about cooling and hydro cooling being one of those options. But if you're dunking things and that water is more than 10 degrees cooler than the crop, this is what can happen with any contaminants that might be in that water. These are photos from Laura Strawn's lab at Virginia Tech, but it shows that if that fruit is more than 10 degrees warmer and that water is cold, it's going to suck into the inside of the fruit whatever was in that water. So this just with dye shows how anything in that water could be internalized. Same thing with the cantaloupe. So not only at the stem scar with the cantaloupe, but you can see that dye even on the edge there after hydro cooling. So we want to be careful that we're not using cold water, which is kind of counterintuitive to, hey, you just told me I want to cool everything down. But in this case, for things like tomatoes, apples, cantaloupes, and mangoes, we don't want to have that problem when we're cooling things down. But those are the 4 biggies where you would see an issue with dunking something where the water's colder and potential infiltration of things in that water.
And now we have a question about evidence of infiltration in crops like broccoli. I mean, from my perspective, I hear people mainly icing broccoli. So it's a single use, and that basically the ice is made from water that also doesn't have any generic E. coli in it. Therefore, the risk is fairly low. I haven't ever heard of any evidence. Normally we think about infiltration with like our bigger, bulkier, kind of crops, but in versus like a leafy green, but I've never seen any evidence of that for broccoli or, anything in that family. Have you?
No, I think you need to look at the structure of these. So, with a tomato as well as so sort of with a cantaloupe's a little different, but definitely a mango and an apple as well. Again, you're going to have that layer on the outside. So it's either going to be a little bit waxy, the cuticle on it. And so this really creates a nice area for these things to get sucked in, right? Because of the structure of these. And so these are mainly those 4 crops that I mentioned: tomatoes, cantaloupe, and mango and apples are where we see this occur most often, this infiltration. And that's really because of the nature of the structure of the fruit.
Yeah.
So yeah, I haven't seen it in true vegetables.
Yeah, a lot of times it's kind of based upon how much airspace you have inside the fruit, because that's really what's forming the vacuum. As you get that temperature differential, hot fruit, you know, basically it's hot air that's being rapidly cooled, it contracts. And so the more airspace you have in those crops, the bigger the driver is going to be. Now, of course, if we leave something sitting in water, it's going to take up some of the water, but that's really where we get really infiltration down deep, as we see in that pretty tomato picture.
All right, so crops we definitely do not want to wash before we take them to market are any of the berries, because again, that is going to shorten your shelf life tremendously, as well as spinach, unless it's really overly dirty. All those individual leaves are really hard to get back dried off again, and having that free moisture there is going to contribute to decay, as well as basil and summer squash. Now, here in Tennessee, a lot of folks that wholesale their summer squash are required by their buyer to wash them before they take them in. However, if we think about the structure of a summer squash, it has all those nice little hairs or trichomes on the outside of the fruit. And so when we're washing it, we're breaking those off. And each one of those where we've broken it off is an area for water loss to occur, or for decay organisms to get in there, or foodborne illness pathogens, same thing. So unless it's required by your buyer, or unless it's completely muddy from a rain event right before you're harvesting, I would not wash summer squash. You always got to do what your buyer wants you to do, but if they're not requiring you to, don't wash it. So how long will they last? This is a publication that Faith and I did several years ago now for a project, but it also, we have the link at the end of the resources. This gives you different crops and their ideal storage temperatures. So we realize that you can't always hit that ideal storage temperature on your farm. Generally, we talked about chilling injury, and some of these crops are going to be better stored between 45 and 55 degrees, and some are going to be better stored at 30 to 35 degrees. But usually you're not going to have multiple cold rooms on your farm. If you can do that, that's fantastic. But if you can't, you have to make those compromises for the crops that you're growing and what you can do, how much volume we have of each of those crops, and what makes the most sense. The other thing is, again, if you're only going to have things in a cold room for a short amount of time, that might mean you could bring the cold room temperature down a little more and still store some of those crops that ideally would be between 45 and 55 degrees. The other thing is, with that CoolBot that I neglected to mention, is you can take one CoolBot and partition a room so you have the temperature set around that 32 degrees on one side, and then you have a partition in there, and that other side can get around that 50-degree mark with one CoolBot. The other option, as Edith mentioned, is she has 2 cold rooms. If you can do that, that's fantastic, because then you can have one at this ideal storage temperature for those crops that are best stored right around 32, like the berries and a lot of the fruits. And then you can have the one for the chilling injury crops. There's another reason that you might want to do that as well, besides just crop temperature. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But here is if I had that ideal 2 coolers set up on my farm. So in the one cooler, again, I'm going to have mostly my true vegetables at 32 degrees, with the exception of the ripe muskmelon and the sweet corn here. In that cooler 2, I'm going to have my chilling sensitive crops at 50 degrees. So I'm going to have my green beans and my cucumbers, most of my fruiting vegetables over here. So that's ideal. But again, you have to do what makes sense on your farm. But just keep that in mind. This is another publication I like. This is from UC Davis, and this is really for Home vegetable storage, but again, we want to meet you where you are. You might not have a cooler available on your farm yet. You might use your refrigerator for some stuff on your farm, or several refrigerators on your farm. And so this shows things that you'd want to store in the refrigerator. This shows things you want to ripen on the counter first and then store in the refrigerator. So pears and nectarines, lots of our stone fruit there. And then things we only want to store at room temperature, or if we had the ability, we'd store them at that 50 to 55 degrees. But if you don't, they're better left at room temperature than sticking in the cold room for long term. So that's a nice little publication, and it's in the resources too, and you can download it, stick it on your refrigerator. So next we're going to talk a little bit about curing, and curing for several crops can really thicken up the skin. That's going to help us reduce that moisture loss over time. It's also going to give us better protection against insects and microbes, keep them out so they can't get in. So for onions and garlic, we want to leave those roots and leaves attached. We want to protect them from the sun and the rain, keep them in a well-ventilated area, keep them for 2 weeks between 80 and 90 degrees. Then we can cut the tops off after that. If you know you're not going to have rain in that 2-week period, you can cure your onions out in the field. And that's a great way to cure them, to make sure that they're getting well ventilation. But if you have a rain event, that can be disastrous. So you want to make sure you have a backup plan of where you can put them if you need to get them out of the field quick. Potatoes are one we're going to actually cure at a lower temperature. So they're going to be right around 60 to 70 degrees for 5 to 10 days. But we want to keep that relative humidity high. So 90 to 95% relative humidity, so we don't get shrinkage of our potatoes while we're curing them. And then sweet potatoes are another one that benefit from curing. So they're going to be back in that higher temperature range, like the onions and the garlic. We want to keep them really high, between 86 and 90 degrees for about 4 to 7 days. And again, we want to make sure that that relative humidity is high, so we're not losing weight in our sweet potatoes. So I mentioned when we're thinking about putting things in a cooler, we have something else to consider besides just temperature, and that's ethylene. Well, ethylene is going to help promote ripening for lots of these crops, and we want them to ripen. It's also going to increase our susceptibility to disease. So you've all heard that saying, one bad apple can spoil the whole bunch. And that's why, because of ethylene production. So it's going to speed everything up. It's going to speed the whole decay process up. It's going to speed up respiration of these crops. And damaged and diseased crops are going to produce high levels of ethylene. So we don't want to store, again, any damaged or diseased crops with our high quality crops. And we don't want to store ethylene producers with ethylene sensitive crops. So here's a list of ethylene producers. Apples fall in there, as well as the stone fruit, apricots, ripening bananas, cantaloupes, peaches, pears, persimmons, plums, quinces, and tomatoes. And then our ethylene sensitive crops are going to be, again, mostly our true vegetables. So asparagus, snap beans got in there, although they're not a true vegetable, they're a fruiting vegetable. Broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cucumbers, and eggplants, more fruiting vegetables got in there. Lettuce, sweet potatoes, okra, bell peppers, squash, spinach, and cabbage, and carrots, and celery. And if we do store those ethylene producers with ethylene sensitive crops, like this iceberg lettuce over here, this russeting that you see on the bottom of this head of lettuce is some of that ethylene damage. So a sign that it's been in an area with more ethylene. This is also important for folks that are flower growers, because a lot of cut flowers are going to be ethylene sensitive. So if you're storing your cut flowers in with your fruits and vegetables, you want to make sure that you have the cut flowers on this ethylene sensitive side. Otherwise, you're going to have petal drop pretty quickly.
Annette, we had a question for you that came up, not about ethylene sensitive crops, but about soft neck garlic. And can you cure the soft neck garlic while they're braided, or should they stay separate before you braid them?
Ooh, that's a good question. If you let them cure, that's going to start to dry down. I would say I would do a little experiment and try it this year. Try to cure it first and then braid it and see if it works. And if not, there's no reason why you couldn't braid it and then try to cure it. But once you braid it, you're going to have a harder time drying out the stem, I think. Yeah, I think you have to experiment.
From someone who's done this, you make a little bit of a sacrifice when you braid soft neck garlic. You don't end up with the best way of curing it by braiding it, because you have to braid it early before it's properly cured. So the best way to cure it is to cure it with it separated and all the air circulation. But then you don't get to have the best conditions for braiding. So to braid it, you make a little bit of a sacrifice.
Perfect. Thanks, Leslie.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So with all of these things, you want to think about the products that you're going to be cooling, how fast you want to get them cold, and then the compatibility of the methods with what you have on the farm, what facilities you have. The next one is going to be your initial capital. So we talked about that low-cost storage room using a CoolBot. That's going to be about as bare bones as you can get for a nice size cooling situation. And then you also want to think about the cost for operating after you get it set up, the energy it's going to take, the labor and the maintenance. So again, a cold room is going to be fairly low cost once it's set up. Once you're talking about hydro coolers or vacuum coolers, you're going to have more energy in the operation of them and maintenance over time. So you have to weigh all these things with what you're growing and what you're trying to achieve on your farm. Remember, when all possible, harvest in the coolest part of the day. Keep those harvest to cooling delays as short as possible, and park your load in the shade, but watch out what's above your shade if it's a tree. So I wanted to share some of these resources with you. Lots of good resources around post-harvest handling. This small-scale post-harvest handling practices from UC Davis is a great resource, and it's still in print. I don't believe there's an online version of that, but I have a link to the UC Davis post-harvest site on the next slide. ATRA also has a nice publication on post-harvest handling of fruits and vegetables. And then that fact sheet that I showed you for the ideal storage temperatures is here from UT. And then that little thing that showed you where to store, whether on the counter or in the refrigerator. This is the Davis link for that at their post-harvest website, as well as the UC Davis post-harvest produce fact sheet. So they have a produce fact sheet on every fruit or vegetable that you can think of at this site, and it'll give you lots of fun facts about produce. What are the commonly seen physiological disorders in that produce? What's the best temperature to store it at? What's the best relative humidity? All sorts of good information in those produce fact sheets. So if you are growing a few commodities or even a lot of commodities, those are great to check out. This is the infrastructure toolkit that I mentioned. It is really an excellent, excellent resource that I would recommend that everybody downloads, because it just has a wealth of information in it. And then if you want more information on coolers or storage facilities, here's a link to the CoolBot website. They also now produce a cooler that you can buy from them that you have to assemble on farm. And they have a little interactive video on that on their website that you could check out. NC State has a pack and cool. So this is a CoolBot that they put on the back of a little trailer. So if you do have electrical hookup at the farmer's market, you can keep the cool going while you're at market or another location. This is John Wilhoit's presentation. So lots of information on building your own low-cost storage there. Then there is the NC State Cool and Ship, which is that portable forced air cooler. If you're a berry grower, that's a great investment. And the USDA Porta Cooler. If you're not familiar with the publication Growing for Market, it's an excellent publication. Most of the articles are written by growers. It's a $30 a year subscription, but well worth the money. These, there's 4 articles, a 4-part series on designing and building a storage facility. I think if you Google that and you Google Growing for Market in front of it, it will pull them up online so that you don't have to have the paid subscription for those. Those are also excellent if you're thinking of designing and building a storage facility on your farm. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have lingering. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Annette. You're, as always, great job today. Let's give Annette a virtual round of applause, everyone. Really appreciate all of her insights and time today chatting with us. So any questions from the group? Hi,
Warm 'em
Leslie.
out.
Did you have one, Leslie? I saw you or maybe you were unmuted originally.
Yeah, I think I'm still unmuted.
You are.
Although, if you don't mind me saying, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on here, but I do have a freestanding 8x10 cooler that I'm selling that I bought from someone, if somebody's interested.
Ah, great resource.
I just never used it. It's been sitting here in storage for 15 years, and I don't think I'm ever going to use it because I built my own inside my barn, so I guess I'm never going to use it.
Leslie, you have a question about where are you located?
I'm located in Lyman, Washington, just outside Cedar Woolley.
All right.
We have a question in there about cooling at the farmer's market. What do you recommend there, Annette?
So that's where that a resource from NC State, the Pack and Cool, would be a good thing to check into. If you do have the capability, if you have electricity at the farmer's market, that's something where you could get that plugged in, or you could probably do a solar sort of arrangement on there. I don't think that's included in the Pack and Cool, but that's a good option because it's a little trailer that they've fitted with that air conditioner unit and the cool bot. And so that's a great option to take to market and keep things cool.
The NC State Pack and Cool, you're going to be looking at probably for the enclosed trailer, I would say, depending upon length, you know, nothing too long, probably about, I don't know, $1,000 to $1,500, and then it's essentially getting it insulated and the cool bot installed, right? So not really like hundreds of dollars, but maybe a couple $1,000 you're looking at there. I've also seen people, you know, that are really like into they're basically hitting a farmer's market almost every day of the week when they get into season. Some of them do invest in reefer trucks, right? Like short, small reefer trucks. I've seen people use that because they really think it makes a difference for them. But I think that that's not for everyone. Okay. Oh, here we go. On a very hot day, around 90 degrees, would you ever drench or dunk leafy greens to cool them? And then how would you make that decision?
That's a great question. So, yeah, I would try not to harvest them when they're 90 degrees because they're going to have a lot of that heat again because of that surface area of the product. So if at all possible, I wouldn't want to harvest them at 90 degrees. If I did have to harvest them, then rather than drenching or dunking them, I might, and I'm assuming you're going pretty much directly to a market situation or something that you're harvesting at that temperature and then wanting to take that heat out. If I'm not going directly to a farmer's market or something, I wouldn't harvest when it's 90 degrees. I would wait till morning. If you're taking it to market the next day, I would get it in a cooler and try to keep it dry. If it's going directly to a market, what we've done in the past at our farmer's market on a 100-degree day, after we get our lettuce there, is we have a spray bottle with clean water in it and we spritz it to maintain its moisture. So it's not really dunked, but we are giving it a little moisture without drenching it. Does that make sense? You're welcome. Why wouldn't I recommend dunking or soaking? Both for food safety and shelf life. You really, there's so much surface area there. The leaves stick together. It's hard to really dry it back down. And so if you're not doing it properly too, then it can be a food safety issue. I know I've heard Betsy Ben from the National GAPS program talk about how she goes to the farmer's market and specifically buys dirty leafy greens from people because she knows they didn't wash them wrong, then that they didn't wash them at all. And she'd rather take them home and wash them herself and know that they were washed properly. So yeah, it can turn into a food safety issue if you're not doing it right. And Faith will talk about that a lot more next week. If you are washing, how to do it right. How about putting the stem in a tray of water? We're talking about lettuce again. Yeah, that would work. Again, you want to make sure that you have clean water. And if you're putting all your stem ends in the same water, then if you do have contamination, now you're spreading it around if there's nothing in there to prevent that contamination. But yeah, for several crops, that can be effective. Asparagus is another one with all those cut stems that can work well.
Yeah, I think, and you know, from a microorganism standpoint, like your soft rots and stuff like that, they're going to love that warm temperature, right? And I don't think you're going to get them cooled down quickly enough that they don't kind of take root and take off if they're really coming, if the greens are coming in that hot.
Yeah, and that's another situation where you might want to change the order in which you're harvesting things. If you're taking a lot of things to market, because leafy greens are going to change with temperature more than a lot of other things that have, you know, more density to them because of that, the shape of them and the surface area. So they're going to absorb that heat more than some other things would. So you might want to harvest them in the morning and harvest something else later in the day. You don't want anything, you don't really want to harvest anything at 90 degrees, but we know you have to. It's just the nature of the business, but you could strategically plan what you're going to harvest when.
Any other questions? Well, hearing none, then thank you again to Annette for sharing all your wisdom with us today. And also thanks to the WSDA Produce Safety Program for giving us this opportunity to chat with you all. As I mentioned, these will be going up on YouTube, and I'll send out the link to everyone so you can have the resource in the future. And yes, thank you very much for your time and attention today. And hope to see you next week when we do a deep dive on washing and what you need to look for and how can you kind of make the best choices for your operation with the food safety and with the knowledge that we're going to be washing a lot of things for marketability. So thanks a lot, everyone. See you hopefully next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you much.